from my opinion, change itself is difficult, right? Change, any kind of change. If I ask a person to change their bed overnight, the person will struggle. See, I say, Robert, tonight you'll sleep in a different room. You will face trouble with that. It's a simple thing. It's within your control, but still you'll struggle. We are talking about organizations, and we are talking about large transformation. And I have a problem with when people oversimplify things, right? It's not that simple. At the same time, it's not that complex. It's within that. So how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think Albert Einstein said, make things as simple as possible and no simpler, right? And I think trying to figure out how to make things simple enough that people can understand it and it can make sense, and at the same time not oversimplify, it's important. I think from a resistance standpoint, I'm moving towards a framework that basically says all change is loss, all of it. Now I've got a little asterisk. I haven't quite figured out how to deal with some aspects of conflict and how to integrate this, but let me pause on loss for a second. And so from a loss perspective, what William Bridges said is effectively, everything involves some loss, even if that loss is nostalgia, right? Even if the only thing you lose is nostalgia. It's like, I used to do it X way and I loved that X way, and it's horribly inefficient. It's an awful way to do it, but I knew how to do it. I learned how to do it that way. And so, he says that all change involves some level of loss. And so I believe that. I believe that we've got to figure out how to deal with that loss. And then, of course, he builds on Kubler-Ross's work that talks about the grieving. And if you look at the way that people process grief, whether you believe in Kubler-Ross or not, basically we go through stages. We have an emotional grieving process around a loss. The other piece that I think I see in terms of resistance, that I see in terms of the way that people get stuck with digital transformations or any kind of change, is conflict. And so the conflict, I think, comes from one of two sources. And we do talk sometimes on conflict, and people are like, no, there's all kinds of people that are conflict. I'm like, no, just two sources. One is perspective. I see things one way, you see things a different way. And because of that, when we enter into a conversation, it's difficult for us to see each other's point of view. That's easier actually to tackle. The second piece is values. And so I may value one thing and you may value another. A guy by the name of Stephen Reese, who is no longer with us, but when he was with us, he worked at the University of Ohio Ohio State University. He said, look, there are 16 basic motivators, and there are things like status and their tranquility and family and social and order and that kind of thing. And so where we end up with resistance is you are doing a change that is high on order, puts everything in neat little boxes. But I'm high on tranquility, and I really just don't want any disruption. I just want to keep going. And those two value systems are then in conflict. So what I see with customers, what I see with other folks, is that they resist change not as resisting change for its sake, but either for its loss or because there's some unresolved conflict that we've not dealt with.
And you added the element of value there.
Yep.
Is it because we have a different value system going? Maybe you believe in certain things that you strongly believe because you were brought up in that way. Perhaps I believe in something else. And right. Is that something that you consider when you are looking into the transformation in that perspective?
Yeah, I look, so Reese's 16 motivators are individualized. So they're like any kind of personality profile test that you take, it's individual. But what you begin to recognize is there's some patterns. So when we're doing a digital transformation or doing any kind of change, we will build personas around our key stakeholders, the key groups of people that we're influencing. And what we tend to find are that there are certain factors that you can expect out of people in certain roles. So, for instance, you would expect a staff accountant to be someone who is high on order. You would expect that. And so then when we communicate with them and when we listen to them, we listen with that frame of reference. We're listening for where are we disrupting their order. And so I don't think that the value systems are primarily driven culturally. I think it's what people individually value. I mean, I think one of the key problems that we have with change is we want to send this one blanket communication out, and it's all about how this is going to better the organization or it's going to do whatever. And people just don't care. They care about what is in it for me. I jokingly, it's like WIIIFM, what is in it for me radio? It's all me all the time. And I joke about it, but it's really the thing. And so we communicate to folks in a way that we largely communicate to folks in a way that is ignoring the value systems that they have, right? When I roll out new mobile technology, I don't talk about how it's going to save the company money and less desktops or whatever. I'm like, you know what? Go to your daughter's dance recital. Go to your son's little league game. In fact, coach it. Go do the things with your family and still be able to support what the company needs out of you. And it's a totally different way of thinking. And people who are corporate minded sometimes will say, well, but that stuff isn't the stuff we should be talking about. I'm like, no, actually, it's exactly what we should be talking about. We want people to use it. We want to show them how it's valuable to them that they use it. And if they do use it, well, then the corporation will get the value, right? We know that. We set the system up. But if we're unwilling to meet people where they are and figure out what they need to be successful for them in their life with their values, then we're not going to get anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I get the part where you sort of, look at the aspect of value, which is at the core front. But how do you communicate that to a leadership where we're talking about a change which should translate into revenue, right? Yep. From the leadership standpoint, that's how it should translate. And yep. And for them, transformation is a project.
Right.
You think about it, it's a transformation, but for them, like if I'm spending X amount of money, then it should translate that into revenue yep. at some point. And from their standpoint, perhaps they are right. But then how do you sell this story around values and the motivations and those aspects?
So I think, when we're talking with leadership, as you said, they've got some sort of, it basically nets out to revenue in most cases, but they've got some sort of an objective. Mm-hmm. What I really try and work back with them on is, so what are our metrics? You want to spend $1 million. You want to save $1 million within the first 6 months or year or 2 years, whatever we want it to be. Okay. So how am I going to know that you're going to get that $1 million? Is it because we increase our sales wins? Is it because we reduce costs? What are those things? And if I work back far enough to find a leading indicator, I can typically find a leading indicator that ends in adoption. Our people are using the system the way we want them to use it. Now, I don't mean adoption in the general sense. I do literally mean it in they're doing the behavior we want them to do. So then I can say, okay, to get them to do that behavior, I need to do X or Y. In order to change their behavior, which is what you need to change the organization to get the results you want, I've got to speak with them in a way that causes them to want to change their behavior. And sometimes I get resistance to that. And so I use some stories. One of the stories I use. So, we are now facing COVID. Even before COVID, I could have told you, you cannot order people into a behavior. And they're like, no, I can tell them and they'll do it. I said, okay, fine. What percentage of people of providers do you believe wash their hands appropriately in a healthcare setting? In acute care setting, mostly hospitals, what percentage do you think? And they're all like, well, 80, 90%, whatever. I'm like, okay, fine. Across the world, it's roughly 20%, according to the World Health Organization. And most of the folks I work with are in the United States. So I say, okay, so what do you think it is in the United States? And they're like, oh, well then, yeah, it's definitely our 90%. I'm like, no, actually, depending upon which numbers you want to believe, it's somewhere between 50 and 80%. Now you have doctors who went to school for 12 years and nurses who went to school for at least 4. And you have all these professionals who are trained in what germs are. And they know the best thing to do is to wash your hands. They're doing it half the time or 80% of the time, 4 out of 5 times. How do you expect to order someone to do something if we can't get doctors to wash their hands when they know it's the right thing? And by the way, this is actual life or death, not revenue and non-revenue. Depending upon the audience, sometimes the audience is a little resistant. I'm like, okay, so let's change the story. How many of you love wearing seatbelts in your car? Nobody loves wearing seatbelts in their car. You wear a seatbelt because it makes you feel safer, right? So if I rewind the clock and I go back to the 1960s, a guy by the name of Ralph Nader really confronted the auto industry with this concept they had of idiots behind the wheel. And he wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. And by the late 1960s, we had seatbelts and we started playing with safety. So in the United States, we now have 49 states that have some level of enforcement about seatbelts. Mm-hmm. Either you can get pulled over or you can get a ticket. Well, okay, what do you think seatbelt compliance is? Well, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation, even after 40 years of them tracking statistics and spending tens of millions of dollars and all this stuff, they're at 90% utilization. Mm-hmm. 90%, 90.7% of people, of miles traveled have seatbelts on. So if you guys want to tell me about ordering people and they're just going to magically do it, I got to tell you, that's just not going to work. Mm-hmm. I don't care who you are. I don't care what the culture is. In certain cultures, that's more acceptable than the U.S. I get it. But you've got to figure out a way to get them to want to do the behavior if you expect them to sustain the behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you suggest in that perspective? Do you say, okay, we want to co-create some of the things perhaps are going to work within the organization, or do you go with, okay, maybe these are some best practices?
Well, I think we work backwards from our end goals, our lagging indicators, the things that we want to get. We keep moving further and further back to figure out what our leading indicators are. We figure out, okay, so to get those leading indicators, what are the behaviors that we need? And then we work with the teams, and it depends on, there's lots of different ways to figure out how to do this, but you involve some people and you figure out, okay, so if I want you to do X behavior, how am I going to get X behavior? And you can't ask that question that directly, but that's what we're trying to get to. And it might be a focus group. It might be a pilot project. It might be, a dozen different ways that we can get to it, but we're trying to get to how do we identify what we need to do to make the behavior acceptable, reasonable, the default answer. How do we remove the barriers? How do we equip them with the right equipment? And I don't mean literally equipment. I mean, do they have the right skills and knowledge and resources?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And earlier you touched a topic about resistance. Yep. Resistance come from, like you said, resistance come from being people used to doing certain things, right? I'm used to doing this way, so I'll stick to this way because I know ins and out, right? Even though, like you said, it's very inefficient, but still I want to do that, right?
Right.
Yeah. And often maybe the other way how the resistance comes is because you might say, okay, if we are going for the transformation, maybe then people need to change their roles, right, within these organizations. Maybe I would be doing similar things, but I have to take on more ownership, more responsibilities, those kind of things.
Right.
Why do people hate those responsibilities, or let's say the ownership, or being challenged, right? Even though they are fully capable of doing things, but still
Right.
people I've seen, at least from my let's say experience, I've seen that people are reluctant to do those things.
I think if you look back at Reese's values, they may value tranquility, they may value family, they may value social life, they may value things other than their status and their reputation and their perceived productivity.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I think, so we don't understand stress very well. And so people think, well, I'll be more stressed if I'm in this role. And that is true at some level, but in many ways is not true. So let me break this down just a bit. So first of all, Amy Edmondson talks about the fearless workplace, or psychological safety, or how do you make it okay and safe for people. And I think anytime that there's changing roles, there's a concern about, will I get to keep my role? Will I be successful enough? There's a fear of failure. But in terms of stress, and in terms of how do I manage these new opportunities, we tend to believe that other people inflict their thoughts into our feelings. So you could make me mad, right? Like you could probably hear your 2-year-old. Well, he made me mad. Okay, well, as a literal statement, that's not possible. Mm-hmm. And it's not possible because we evaluate the situation and then we react to it. As it pertains to stress, Richard Lazarus said, look, there are stressors in the environment. We assess their probability and their impact and our ability to cope. And if those things don't line up, then we will feel stress. But as long as the probability is low, an asteroid hitting the planet, the impact is low, I'll just replace it, or the ability to cope is high. You know what? If I lose my job, I've got a year's worth of savings and I've got a really good network of friends and it'll all be okay. That does not produce stress. It's when those three things are out of alignment. So when you're confronted with people who don't want to take the opportunities that are put in front of them, they could lack the self-esteem and have a concern for failure, or they have a perception, a belief that it will mean increased stress or increased impact on areas of their life that they're unwilling to let be impacted. Again, family, social are the two big ones.
I want to sort of look into the transformation into three different facets. I would say because for me, whenever we want to approach a transformation, I see the common one, a very generic way we used to define in the past as well. It's the people that we look into the transformation as a core front. And then we also look into the processes, how we are going to get there, and then any tools that we want to embrace, right? And often, I see from the leadership standpoint, we are largely focused on technology and maybe processes, to use those. Often we neglect the things that perhaps is one of the more important vertical is people. Right. And how do you take these things together? Right. Because these are the things that should go hand in hand, but often it has been neglected. I think so,
Right.
How do you take all these things hand in hand?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I have to say, I've seen exactly the same thing you have, right? We implement a new process, or the favorite thing seems to be we implement a new technology. And I guess, a few decades ago, implementing a new technology could have been the right solution, right? Maybe the technology was the big gap, but anymore, right? Like, I don't care if you're on Google or you're on Microsoft or you're on Oracle, or like, it just doesn't matter anymore. The differences between the players are not wide enough to justify a focus there. But at the same time, I recognize that for leadership, it's easy. It's hard to say. Well, we have done something to improve our people, right? Or you say you can't do a mass firing and say, well, we swapped out our Google for Microsoft last year. This year, we're going to swap out our people for new people. Like, that doesn't work.
That doesn't work. Yeah.
And so it's hard for leaders to say, I've done something when it comes to people. It's hard to measure it. And because of that, it makes it the thing that they want to avoid, right? If you can't figure out how to measure it, if you can't know if you're headed in the right direction, well, we'll do the other stuff that we do sort of know, and then we'll come back to it. I think that some very self-aware leadership is starting to look now at, how do I address the people aspect, even if I can't get it exactly right, even if I can't exactly measure it, even if I don't know for 100% sure. They're starting to embrace the uncertainty a little bit. And I think that that's helpful. I think that they're going to get it wrong because you have to, but the fact that they're paying attention to it improves the outcomes that you get, because there's at least some energy expended in that direction. So I think if you look, one of the fun things is the change management organizations. There's some people that say, well, the 70% failure rate for changes is a myth. And I have to tell you, I've looked at the numbers and I can't prove with absolute certainty that it's 70%, but I can tell you that it looks right. If you look at project failure rates, if you look at the complexity of change projects, if you put all the pieces in the blender and you see what you get on the output, 70% fail. Well, with a 70% failure rate, I either need to play baseball or I need to do something different.
Yeah.
Right? Even the weathermen are more predictable than 30% of the time now.
That's true. And because I see projects being failed left and right. It's not like, I haven't seen a very, let's say, with few exceptions, I haven't seen really a good story to tell, right? Okay, this was really great story to talk about. Like we went from point A to point B to point C, and we already visualized that on day one itself, right? It doesn't happen that way, right?
Right.
And what bothers me is like, because transformation is evolutionary, and we learn, we iterate, and that part of the communication sometimes is misleading towards the leadership, right?
It sort of depends on where they are on their journey. So again, let me rewind the clock 30 years and say that Agile really hadn't taken off, right? A bunch of guys met in Utah and they said, hey, this is the right answer. And they were right for some kinds of projects, but not all of them. And then when I would have these conversations about iterative, and I'm specifically avoiding Agile because it's got too many connotations. If I would talk about iterative, then people would say, then people would go, well, but I've got to have my project plan and I got to know when I'm going to be done. And I got to know my cycles. And I'm like, well, the iron triangle of project management is cost, scope, and quality. And if you can't pin any of those, then I can't tell you when you're going to be done.
Yeah.
Right. And they're like, well, but we want it to be really great quality, and that's great. Okay. So, but what's that mean? So when I'm having conversations with leaders, the conversations I'm having with leaders are, where are you on your Agile journey? Do you recognize that things are iterative? Right. And if they recognize that things are iterative, then what I can say is, let's use the same approach. We're going to define our end state vision. We know exactly how we want to be perceived in the market and what we want to be doing. But we don't know how to do it. And we don't know how to get from where we are today to that point. We can draw a couple of signs some mile markers to know, yes, we're making progress, but we don't exactly know how to get there. And so in those conversations, it's actually not that hard because they already have this mindset of, I can draw an endpoint, I can look at my current state, and I can keep making decisions about how do I move myself further towards the vision I want. If they have a very traditional waterfall, iteration less kind of point of view, then it's a lot more difficult. Honestly, sometimes I just grind them into the ground and I say, okay, well then you tell me everything that has to happen to get from here to there. And they go, well, that's what my people are for. I said, well, then you get your people in a room and you have them do it. Well, I don't know that we've got that kind of time. Oh, okay. Right. And I just I keep working at them to go, okay, so you want this to happen and you think you can define everything right now. Mm-hmm. At some point, they will eventually say to me, well, but I don't know yet. At which point I can go, okay, well, then we need to iterate. We need to do something and learn, and then course correct, and do something and learn and course correct, and do what, and do what iterative or agile does. So some of those conversations are really easy, and some of those conversations are really, really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. It's maybe like, you mentioned, because we had this focus, maybe 30 years back, we had to focus largely on technology, and maybe, the perceptions back then was somewhat more like making a building, right? It's structural. Mm-hmm. You have a fixed plan there. You'll have 10 different rooms, 4 different toilets, and so forth, 20 different windows, fixed size. So I think that's the perception people had about project management overall, right? And maybe that sort of was a way of thinking for the people who are running the business operation, and maybe that had the influence, and that fundamentally didn't change over time, right? And maybe that is the reason, like, people are so used to receiving the fixed project specifications, and they want to stick to that, right? So and
I think what it is, and when you look at project management, you really put things into 2 big buckets, right? Like, there's the empirical, and then there's the things we've done before. Empirical and heuristic. And so, the 50th time I build a building, I have a plan for it. I know how it works. There are no uncertainties, or they're very small. And I go execute a project plan in a single phase. I can do that. When you're dealing with software and transformation and people, those messy humans, mm-hmm. You can't do that. It's always heuristic. You're always desperately trying to get closer to the center. And one of the things that I sometimes use with folks who are still stuck in that mindset, and hey, we're building a building and this is the way the building is I use this book. It's called How Buildings Learn. Mm-hmm. And what's neat about it is it talks about how the structure itself stays the same, but the facade changes, the floor plan changes. And understanding that can help them to understand that there's some things that we have to have set in stone. And by the way, in an organization, that should be mission and values. Those things shouldn't change.
Yep.
But beyond that, how we deliver to the market, those sorts of things have a degree of flexibility to them that, if you allow them, they can adapt very well to the market.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I had a chance to look into your blog, and I sort of looked into one of the topic that you've written briefly. I didn't go into detail. I must be admitting that upfront. But you mentioned a point about the relationship. There is a relationship between trust and vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
And why I'm bringing this up is I want to challenge you a little bit there. Why? Because because you mentioned if you trust, then you must be open to being vulnerable, right?
Yes.
You want to create a trust environment, then you want to be vulnerable, and then people start to trust you more, perhaps.
Right.
But on the flip side, I want to be a little bit critical, and these are not my words, but I'm just being critical. That, it's a sign of weakness, right? It's a sign of weakness. If as soon as you are being vulnerable, from the leadership perspective, you are a bit vulnerable, and because you are showing the sign of weakness. How do you see those two views?
So the tricky part is, how do you get to appropriate vulnerability? Mm-hmm. Right? Because you can be vulnerable in ways which reduces your perception, or you can be vulnerable in ways that show authenticity. So let me give you a couple of examples. So first example, I wear glasses, and I have no problem wearing glasses. The truth is, that's a vulnerability. My eyesight isn't perfect. Now, were I to really go dig into it, most people don't have perfect eyesight. Almost everybody wears some form of eye correction these days. And a lot of people prefer contacts, which is completely fine. But for me, I see no need. I'm completely comfortable with the fact that you're going to know that I don't have perfect eyesight. Mm-hmm. That's a vulnerability. So that one's a simple one that everybody can reuse. The other one I'll tell you, so and we won't, I know we won't have time for some of the things that we've got a heart for. My wife and I have a heart for in terms of supporting people, but we have in the past worked with some recovery groups. And so we have folks who are recovering from lots of different things: alcohol, drugs, abuse, just a whole set of things that are in that group. But what we learned was that if we would lead a group and we would start with vulnerability, either our own, or we would find a trusted member of the group who could lead and be vulnerable, it changed the entire tenor of the group. Mm-hmm. The person that we picked to share first could be vulnerable in a way where no one would feel shame for them. No one would feel lesser of them, but they could share who they were, their authenticity, their authentic self. They could share that. And it created this wonderful space where everybody could get healed. So your point about leaders who don't want to show vulnerability because they don't want to be perceived as weak, totally get it. My question to the leader is, what vulnerability could you show that doesn't mean you're weak? Is it that you wear glasses? Is it something different? Because when you're authentic, people know it and they will respond to it. Mm-hmm. Right? Even in our conversation in the last 3 minutes, I shifted and I became more personal and I shared more information, and your body language changed and I could see it, right? Because we weren't talking about abstract anymore. We were talking about, how do I help people? Mm-hmm. And I'm vulnerable. I mean, that I'm sitting in recovery groups and I'm leading those groups. You got to be in the back of your mind at some level going, well, why was he there? Right. But at the same time, it gave us a place to connect. It gave us a way to share. So if you're a high status person, so back to Reese's stuff, if you're a high status person, vulnerability is going to be super hard for you. Mm-hmm. Because you perceive that anything you do to admit vulnerability creates weakness, and that's really bad for you. Mm-hmm. But for other people who value social interaction, who value family, who value other things, it's a little easier to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because this is something I see from the leaders, because some of them are very close to me and I see a different person, like when interacting with a person, like offline, having a very open conversation, and I see those lighter moments and those, those are different moments, right? But at the same time, I see the same person within the, let's say, a team session, or let's say, in a meeting as such. and it's very difficult to really comprehend the whole information's like why the person is not being open to the team versus what is the challenge, right? So I try to rationalize that, and I just don't get an answer. I don't have an answer for that. And
so the short answer is they don't trust the team.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's the short answer, is they don't trust their team. They trust that they believe that someone who is in that space is going to stab them in the back, or is going to use what they say out of context or in a way that's painful. That's the short version. Now the question would be who, and is it appropriate? I don't know. Mm-hmm. But you can build a rapport with a leader, and they'll trust that you'll keep their confidences, that you won't misconstrue what they've said. But in a group of 10 people, if they don't have that rapport with each individual person, they won't go there.
Why I'm bringing this up one more time is because often when we talk about people, right, you want to approach the people with the way they would hope to be approached with, right, in the first place. Yeah. And like I said in the past as well, like people are the main core front of the transformation. Yeah. And when you only delegate, when you only delegate and when you only become the person who is going to come and provide you with some instruction, then perhaps it's a different way people look at you versus how they should normally look at you, right?
Right.
And that part has been a challenge for me to sort of, take the leadership into that journey, into the journey of real transformation, where the leadership transform themselves to transform others.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is the hardest part for me, at least for now,
So it's a funny thing. So lots of interactions and conversations about leadership and transformation and how do you do it. And some people want to say that for the organization to transform, everybody has to become basically self-enlightened, right? They basically say, well, everybody's got to be enlightened. And I'm like, well, that is completely not going to happen. Now, do I think that leadership should become more self-aware? Do I think that they should become more I'm going to say the word self-confident. That's not exactly right.
No.
But do I believe that their inner strength, that their ability to weather the storms will be reflected in the organization and its transformation and its growth? And yes, I do. Absolutely. But to say that every member of the organization has to go do that self-work and that changing themselves, not going to happen. Mm-hmm. We work with executive coaches, and of course the executives can all have coaches. The directors can have coaches sometimes, and you get below director level and there are no coaches, right? Like it doesn't scale. And so you've got to find a way to enable people to go deeper when they're willing, to support those who are not, and find a way to work with everyone, because it's not, it's just the idea that I'm going to make everybody enlightened and everybody's going to sing Kumbaya next to a fire doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work, indeed. What I've seen, I think it happens in a bubble, right? It's like you start with someone or some section of the corporations or some entities. Maybe you want to just take it small, one thing at a time. Maybe that's one of the approach. And sometimes the leaders are mentally prepared to go all in, right? That's a different situation. That usually doesn't happen like that.
Right.
There's always going to be that smaller pockets that you want to play with, and then they will see those smaller incremental changes, if they are in the right path or not. And then based on those one or two cases, they would see, okay, maybe it can be scalable or not, right? So ideally, you want to work in a scenario where there is a big, strong buy-in from the leadership. But how do you deal in an organization where, let's say, there is half-heartedly, the transformation is happening? How do you even jump into those kind of organizations?
Well, I evaluate what I want to get out of it, right? If a leader isn't fully behind something, I'm going to ask questions like, why? What is it? There's some degree. The truth is, right? So we said earlier, 70% of projects fail. So what the leaders are doing is they're spreading their bets, right? They're on a roulette wheel and they've put their bets out on the table so that if any 5 of them lose, they've still got 2 winners, and they can communicate those winners up to the rest of the organization. So I think I ask those questions. Why do you think this is going to fail? What can I do to prove to you that it won't? In what are your risks? What are you facing? Because I think that's the interesting set of questions is, if you know that 2 out of 3 swings are going to miss, why are you swinging anyway? What's making you think I've got to swing? And what makes you think, what are the things that you think can get in the way with connecting with the ball and really hitting a home run? And some of those things you've got control of and some of them you don't, right? Oh, well, we're going to move to, we're going to disrupt an industry and we're going to become the next Uber, right? Well, or we're going to become the first Uber, right? The first people that did that, have got to go, whoa, how do you, I don't know if that's going to work or not. And so if a leader is trying to support one of those projects, moonshots or 10X projects, I'm asking them, how do we fail fast? How are we going to know quickly? And the truth is, I work on projects all the time where people aren't committed. And some of those projects fail. Do they fail because of something I do? Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes they fail because they're not the right answer to the market's need. And my goal is always just fail fast, fail cheap, fail in a way that teaches us. Yeah, I'd love to work only on winning projects, but that's not realistic.
Yeah. The challenge is, you mentioned fail fast. It's often misunderstood, in a lot of sense, because people think failing fast means, maybe a couple of months and you already know that you're going to fail. It doesn't happen like that, right? So maybe can you elaborate there a little bit from your opinion? What does failing fast really mean?
I think it's related. So first of all, I think it's related to minimum viable product, right? So what do we think is minimally viable in the market? And I think that we take a stab at minimally viable product. We then figure out what it would take to get to it. We do that. And then we decide whether the market buys it or not. And if the market doesn't buy it, we failed. But now the question is, did we learn enough about the market and what's happening to make the change to do the next minimum viable product, or what we think is the next minimum viable product? So that for me is the primary way that I see fail fast expressed, is how do I define the smallest thing that I can test reasonably, and then know how do I test it, and how do I know that test is or isn't valid, right? And that's sometimes hard, right? We did the Confident Change Management project, the big course that's online async. We did that in the middle of the pandemic. And wow, it's hard to read numbers when everybody's indicators are completely random. I have some parts of the training market that are going really, really well, 10x of what they've ever done in 5 years. And I've got other parts that are doing 30% of what they've ever done for the last 4 or 5 years. And so it's a hard read. And so I'll tell you, I failed to fail fast on that one. because I couldn't get to the numbers that would indicate a clear decision one way or the other. I think a lot of people are facing that now in COVID times. The things that used to work don't still work. A friend of mine works at an oil and gas company. They sell gas to consumers in the United States. And he said to me, he said, Rob, look, the thing we always did doesn't work. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, the deal is when you lower the price of gas, people buy more of it. I'm like, okay, supply and demand. I get that. Right. He goes, no. What you don't know is that in March and April and May of 2020, nobody bought gas. Right. It didn't matter. We could sell it at a loss just to keep our plants going, and people still weren't going anywhere because everybody was freaked out, huddled down in their homes, and nobody was going anywhere.
Yeah.
And that's the problem we're in for Fail Fast with the situation we find ourselves in, because none of the indicators work anymore. Mm-hmm. I shouldn't say none of them work. Some of them work, but a lot of them have been disrupted. And so because they've been disrupted, it's difficult to know what is a failure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And is it a failure post COVID-19 apocalyptic times and we just need to wait? Or is it something that we should abandon? And I tell you, one of the other things that I've learned in business over the years is sometimes you have to leave incubators running. Mm-hmm. The chicks don't hatch when you expect them to hatch, but you leave the incubator running because something's going to pop, and it's going to do so at a time that you would never expect or know. There's a timing to the market that is not possible to predict. I was doing mobile technology in 2000, mm-hmm. and that was Pocket PC days. And it wasn't until 2006 when Apple released the iPhone that the market changed and shifted and became real. Mm-hmm. And had I left that incubator running, had I left all those pieces running, then I would have been in a position to take advantage of that. But I didn't. So Fail Fast for me is figure out what are the indicators that will tell you should continue and invest, or you definitely need to shut it down. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned about this, the 6 key change, management. I think you wrote a book of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the 6 keys to confident change management is on Amazon, available electronically or, in, print form. It made it to #1 in office management. So we're super proud of that. But it is, a part of a bigger set of offerings on confidentchangemanagement.com, which are designed to help people be more effective at change management and digital transformation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because what I found was, over a decade ago when I started, I couldn't find resources that would tell me what change management was or where to go. And we've got 20 models. There'll be 21 models up soon, different change models, different ways people think about change. And I couldn't figure out where they were. I didn't know where to go to figure out who William Bridges was, or Kubler-Ross was, or Daryl Conner, or John Cotter, or there just wasn't a place. And so we built it.
Mm-hmm. So what are the things that people can learn by reading this book?
I think it's the core fundamentals of what are the big blocks that you've got to figure out how to do. You've got to do some basic project management. You have to understand how to motivate people. You have to understand communication strategy, but you also have to understand communication skills. How do you know how to transmit on WIIFM? Yeah. How do you manage stakeholders? Right. And stakeholders you manage different groups differently. Right. And then how do you deal with things like wicked problems? Mm-hmm. How do you think in systems? I think thinking in systems is coupled with agile thinking, mm-hmm. or iterative thinking, right? Because when you think in systems, you're like, if I iterate this 1,000 times, what's going to happen? But those are really the key skills that it will teach you. I think it's a good. I think it's a good primer. I have to be careful about the book because the book is a book and it's a readable book. It's not the be all end all. It's not the answer to every question.
Of course, because whenever we express ourselves, we're expressing from our own experience, right? So maybe the expression itself is not adequate at in some cases, but you try to bring in everything that you have learned over the years and all the references, and like you said, it's a primer. So maybe it might be a starting point for some people like who are going to listen to this podcast as well. And I want to change a little bit of subject because you are into the technological space, and I want to sort of look into beyond the transformations and beyond everything that we talked so far. It's about your interest towards the new technology. It's about what keeps you awake in those aspects. So maybe I want to start with, what are your curiosity now as far as new technologies are concerned?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a project going on for mixed reality or augmented reality. We're using a Microsoft HoloLens to train environmental services workers in hospitals to clean better. It's a neat thing in all the work that we've done about educating and how do you train people better. We know that when we give them instant feedback, when we make things relevant and fun and on and on and on, that honestly is the thing that's the most interesting to me. And if you had talked to me several years ago before we started the project, I would have said augmented reality is a toy. It's a game. You'd never do it. And then this application came up where you have the invisible things, germs, that we needed to be able to allow people to see and learn how to clean effectively. And for me, that's a home run. I am so excited that we're going to be able to reduce healthcare associated infections.
Interesting. I sort of, throw these questions to every entrepreneurs or every leader that comes to talk to me, because people have different interests, as far as technology is concerned. They are curious about blockchain, they are curious about AI, and I get the sense of why they are interested in those different technologies. Okay, I see that we've already spent about an hour. I think we've come to the end of our segment. Thank you, Rob. It was definitely interesting conversation with you. I get to learn a lot. I get to also see your point of view as far as change is concerned, how to deal certain challenges. You explained that pretty well. It was interesting conversation.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it as well.